Is the Republican argument against women voting getting new traction? I mean, by the way, that's the title of my op-ed over at HartmannReport.com today. The Republican nominee for governor of North Carolina. By the way, this guy is or was the lieutenant governor, Mark Robinson. And when he was running for lieutenant governor, weirdly, in a speech before the Republican women of Pitt County in March of 2020, he won the race. I mean, he became lieutenant governor. He came right out and said, I absolutely want to go back to the America where women can't vote. And he then goes into this riff about, social change and stuff. But, I mean, it's just weird. But this is nothing new. I mean, Ann Coulter just 4 months ago said, once again, it's time to reconsider our rash experiment with women's suffrage. Michigan Republican John Gibbs, who was the official candidate for Michigan's 3rd district. He didn't win. He was beat by a Democrat, but he was in the race. He won the primary. Had laid out a website some years ago arguing that it is, that we shouldn't allow women to vote, period. I mean, in 1923, the Equal Rights Amendment was first proposed. It passed the House of Representatives in 1973. But every year in the Senate, it gets blocked by a Republican filibuster. Republicans just basically hate women and don't want them to have equal rights and certainly don't want them to vote. So how has this been playing out? Well, it turns out that the Republican anti-voting legislation, the voter suppression legislation, principally voter ID legislation, there's been a lot of conversation on this program and in many other venues about how badly that hits people of color, particularly black people and Hispanic people. There's very little discussion about how it impacts women. But the fact of the matter is that many women, as many as a third of America's married women in America, do not have ID that in those Republican states that have strict ID requirements. And there's a bunch of the strictest ones are Arkansas, Georgia, Indiana, Kansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. In those states where you can be called upon to present your birth certificate to vote along with your driver's license, if your birth certificate has your maiden name and your driver's license has your married name and you cannot present a piece of paper showing that you legally changed your name with the state, they don't let you vote. And, I mean, this is, in Texas, for example, a district court judge, Sandra Watts, was turned away from voting because one of her documents had her maiden name as her middle name and another one had her, her birth middle name as her middle name. Had she not been a judge, had she not known, I mean, she's a district judge, right? She knew how to use the system. But had she not been, she probably would have done what many women in this circumstance do. They just say, okay, I'm just going to stop voting. I mean, this is from the Brennan Center, okay? A solid, credible group. Voter ID laws have a disproportionately negative effect on women, they write. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, 1/3 of all women, I'm sorry, this is from the National Organization for Women citing the Brennan Center. 1/3 of all women have citizenship documents that do not identically match their current names, primarily because of name change at marriage. About 90% of women who marry in the United States adopt their husband's name. That means, they write, that roughly 90% of married female voters have a different name on their ID than the one on their birth certificate, and an estimated 34% of American women could be turned away at the polls unless they have precisely the right documents. Now, in many of these states, they have not been strictly enforcing this. They've just been letting people vote, basically. But now that abortion is going to be a major deciding factor in the election this fall, in those states that have these strict matching requirements, you can expect to see, not just, by the way, not just married women. This also hits older voters. For example, there were 12 nuns who were all in their 80s and 90s, who were turned away from voting in Indiana. Excuse me. And why were they turned away from voting? Because their driver's licenses, which they all had, and passports, which they all had, were all out of date because they weren't traveling anymore, they weren't driving anymore, and so they hadn't bothered to renew them. And the Secretary of State at the time, Ted Rokita, bragged about this. He says, Indiana's voter ID law applies to everyone. From all accounts that we've heard, the sisters were aware of the photo ID requirements and chose not to follow them. Right. Women are the largest group of registered voters, and they tend to turn out at high levels, so nationwide around 68.4%, much higher than men. But Republicans are using every trick in the book to try to, number one, suppress the votes of people of color, but number two, or actually I think you could flip this upside down. Number one, suppress the votes of women, and number two, suppress the votes of people of color. So if you live in one of these states that have these strict requirements, particularly the ones that say, you know, if you've got a period after your middle initial on your driver's license and there's no period after your middle initial on your passport or something, or on, you know, on whatever other piece of documentation you have. I guess it wouldn't be on the passport because they require you to fill out your full middle name, but you get my point. If there is any inconsistency at all between the two types of ID that you must present, they don't let you vote. And there's a lot of women who are going to be confronting that this November. So if you are a woman and you live in one of those states, forewarned is forearmed. Make sure that your ID is all, you know, nice and tight. That you know, if your birth certificate has your maiden name and your driver's license has your married name, be sure that you have some sort of proof that you got married. And if you changed your name legally, and in some states you're going to have to prove that you actually petitioned the state for a name change. Most women never do that, by the way. They simply start using their married name. And, you know, everybody has just kind of let it slide by. It's technically illegal. Technically, you have to apply for a name change. But I'd say probably 95% of all women who change their names when they get married don't do that. And this could, you know, come back and haunt them when it comes time to vote. And by the way, this entire voter ID thing is just complete BS. I mean, there was 250,000 people who voted in the primaries and the general election in 2020, and there were 194 convictions for voter fraud. Voter fraud does not exist in any democracy anywhere in the world. It never has. It's such a small and inconsequential thing. And it's usually by mistake. It's usually people who think they're eligible to vote but aren't. But the Republicans saw this as a tool that they could use. This started in Indiana. In 2006, in Indiana was the first state in 2006 to require voter ID. Prior to that, there was no requirement. Because, you know, who's going to go to the trouble of lying about who they are to vote? I mean, the impact on the election is negligible. Yes, we want our voice counted, but, I mean, who does that? Nobody, or very few people, so few people. You're more likely to be struck by lightning than you are to be caught voting, or than you are to be voting illegally or committing voter fraud. But what they did in Indiana is they looked at the numbers, the Republicans, and what they found was that, let me see if I can get the exact data here. I mean, it's pretty, here it is. 34% of American women don't have government-issued ID with their current legal name on it. 25% of vote-eligible blacks don't have voter ID. And 18% of Social Security voting senior citizens don't have ID, whereas only about 4% of white men don't have that kind of ID. So the Republicans looked at this and said, hey, if we want more white men to vote, and we want fewer women and black people and elderly people to vote, this is easy. We just require voter ID. And like I said, Indiana was the first to do it in 2006. It's been, what, 18 years? Yeah, 18 years now. And now pretty much every red state has done this. Not every state does, but certainly every red state does. And this is their big scam to prevent women from voting. Meanwhile, the Republican Party has become a full-fledged anti-sex movement, according to Rebecca Solnit over at The Guardian. You know, after Alito and Clarence Thomas both cited the Comstock Act, and you know, recently, I wrote about this a couple weeks ago. And now they're basically declaring war on Planned Parenthood and of course, abortion. She writes, the assumption that these norms will, the current norms, that women have the right to vote, that women have, you know, that women have access to birth control, that women have access to abortion. The assumption that norms will persist is these days a dangerous obtuseness, whether it's about climate, domestic policy, society, or the international order. And she talks about the backlash to Roe, you know, to Roe being overturned in June of 2022. But she said that doesn't spare women in red states from the horrific consequences of the decision. and that includes prosecution for miscarriages. Mark Joseph Stern, for example, tweeted on 27 March, the anti-abortion movement's end goal is to let doctors refuse treatment, including life-saving emergency care, for patients whom they deem to be sinful and morally impure. In May of 2023, the Heritage Foundation declared on social media, quote, conservatives have to lead the way in restoring sex to its true purpose and ending recreational sex and senseless use of birth control pills. Right. This is the Heritage Foundation. Project 2025 declares the USAID Office of Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment should remove all language on USAID websites, in agency publications and policies, and in all agency contacts and grants that include the terms gender and gender equality, and should also remove references to sexual and reproductive rights. Women, the Republicans have put a bullseye on your back. Wake up, pay attention. This is a big deal, and I'm telling you, you're going to see massive voter suppression this November, and we need to get ready for it. Donald Trump, it turns out, became a billionaire, a real billionaire, with this Trump World, the DJT stock. How did they get there? Well, it turns out that there's some rather skeezy characters and a Russian oligarch involved.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
I'll tell you about that right after this. Stay with us.